Before the crowd could even take their seats, a single gunshot tore through the air, and in that instant, the unstoppable force known as Charlie Kirk was silenced forever. Millions watched in disbelief. How could a man so full of life, so fearless in his faith, be struck down in the very place where he had come to inspire others? This was not just an assassination, it was a martyrdom, and it shook the foundations of a movement built on courage, conviction, and Christ. But the truth behind Charlie's final days is darker, more haunting, and more revealing than anyone could imagine. What drove him to walk into danger, knowing enemies wanted him gone? Why did he say, "I know they want me dead," only weeks before that tragic moment? And what really happened in those final seconds when his eyes lifted, not toward fear, but toward eternity? In this video, you will uncover the hidden story of his rise, the cracks beneath the surface, the forces that hunted him, and the faith that made him unbreakable even in death. You'll see how a teenager with no degree built one of the most powerful voices in America, how he stood firm when the world demanded silence, and how his legacy still burns brighter than the bullet that tried to extinguish him. Do you believe his death was simply tragedy? Or was it destiny? Was this the price of truth in an age of deception? Comment your thoughts below, because this story is not just about Charlie. It's about all of us, about the battles we fight, and about the light we must carry forward. If this journey moves your heart, like, share, and subscribe, because together we will make sure his voice is never silenced. Childhood and formation. He was not born into a palace of gold or a fortress of power. Charlie Kirk came into this world like any of us, fragile, searching, shaped by the ordinary and the extraordinary moments of his youth. But inside that boy was a flame, a spark that hinted at something far greater than anyone could have imagined. His family gave him the foundation of faith, the steady rhythm of values passed down through prayers, stories, and the weight of responsibility. Even as a child, he was drawn to questions bigger than himself. Why do we suffer? What is truth? What makes life worth living? These weren't just idle thoughts. They were seeds planted deep in the soil of his soul, waiting for the storms of life to water them. Imagine a boy sitting at the edge of a crowded classroom, his voice quiet, but his eyes alive. While others dreamed of fame or comfort, he dreamed of conviction. His earliest struggles were not marked by wealth or privilege, but by the realization that the world was broken, divided, and often hostile to the truth. He knew loneliness, he knew doubt, he knew the sting of rejection, but those very struggles became chisels in the hand of God, carving away fear and shaping a character unshakable in its purpose. Every insult, every failure, every locked door became a lesson whispered from above. Stand firm, endure, and let your weakness become strength. He found his gift early, the gift of words, of speaking not just to minds but to hearts. He would watch preachers, teachers, leaders, and he realized that words could move mountains inside people. When he spoke, even as a teenager, there was a weight, a gravity, as though something eternal was pressing through his voice. It was more than talent. It was calling, and that calling was tested again and again. There were those who mocked him, saying he was too young, too naive, too bold to dream of changing the world. but he carried within him a quiet answer. Moses was slow of speech. David was only a shepherd. Paul was a persecutor. Yet God used them all. Why not me? One memory from his youth reveals the core of his heart. He once confided, "If I had just 30 seconds to live, I would use them to tell someone about Jesus." That wasn't rhetoric. It was his reality. He believed that every breath had eternal weight. Every word could be the difference between despair and hope. Even then, he lived as if time was short, as if his life was borrowed, as if each day must be poured out like water onto the dry ground of a thirsty generation. That intensity, that sense of mission, didn't come later when fame arrived. It began in his boyhood, when he realized faith wasn't a Sunday routine, but a fire consuming every part of his life. His struggles as a young man also shaped the sharp edges of his worldview. He grew up watching the rising tide of confusion on campuses, the erosion of family, the silencing of faith in public spaces. These weren't abstract issues, they were personal wounds. He would walk through schools where God's name was mocked, where truth was relative, where hope seemed thin. And instead of despairing, he felt something stir. If no one else will speak, then I must. That conviction, born in the smallness of classrooms and the harshness of rejection, would become the foundation of his life's work. Every journey of greatness begins with a wound and a whisper. The wound that humbles, the whisper that calls. Charlie's wound was seeing a culture drift from truth, and the whisper was the unmistakable call of God saying, "Rise and lead them back." That is why, even as a teenager, he started standing in front of peers, unafraid to speak about politics, faith, and the hard questions most adults avoided. It was awkward. It was raw, but it was real, and it caught fire. Others saw in him not just boldness, but authenticity. He wasn't trying to impress, he was trying to awaken. We often forget that leaders are not formed in stages and spotlight, but in silence and struggle. His nightly prayers, the verses scribbled on scraps of paper, the moments he stood alone against ridicule, those were the altars where his future was forged. The family walks, the quiet talks with mentors, the Bible opened late at night when he should have been asleep. Those were his training grounds. And from those places he emerged not with arrogance but with humility. He often said his intellect was surpassed only by his humility, and this was true even then. He listened more than he spoke. He absorbed wisdom, and he invited correction, knowing that pride destroys, but humility builds. What makes his childhood so extraordinary is not that it was free of hardship, but that hardship became holy. His doubts turned into discipline. His loneliness turned into longing for God. His small victories turned into stepping stones for greater battles ahead. And through it all, he remained anchored by family, his parents, his loved ones, the roots that reminded him of who he was beyond any stage. They kept him grounded, reminding him that before he was a voice for millions, he was a son, a brother, a boy who needed grace just like anyone else. The lesson here is timeless. Greatness is not born in applause, but in obscurity. It is in those hidden years when no one is watching that character is tested. Charlie's story reminds us that the cracks in our early lives, the wounds we wish we could erase, may be the very places where God plants seeds of destiny. Perhaps you too have scars from your youth, moments of shame, failure, or pain. But if you look closer, those scars can become signs of calling, the very things that equip you to help others. Comment below. Do you believe the wounds of childhood can be turned into weapons of strength? Or do you think pain only destroys? Your story, like Charlie's, may hold an answer that changes everything. As his childhood gave way to adolescence, the boy who once wrestled with questions now carried answers that would shake campuses and boardrooms alike. The fire that began in silence was about to roar in public, and soon the world would know the name Charlie Kirk, not as a prodigy of privilege, but as a servant of truth, forged in the ordinary struggles that make extraordinary men. The rise to fame was coming, and with it, the weight of destiny. Rise to fame. It is almost impossible to imagine the audacity it took for a teenager, with no college degree, no wealthy backers, no polished resume, to plant the seed of what would become one of the most influential movements in America. Yet that was the essence of Charlie Kirk. He looked at a world spinning out of control, at classrooms drowning in confusion, and he decided not to wait for permission. He founded Turning Point USA with little more than conviction, courage, and a relentless sense that time was short and truth was urgent. Where others saw barriers, he saw doors waiting to be forced open. Where others whispered, he shouted. And slowly, the world began to listen. Picture the young Charlie standing at the edge of a campus courtyard, microphone in hand, facing rows of skeptical students and hostile professors. They hurled insults, they mocked, they dismissed him. But instead of shrinking back, he leaned into the storm. He was not there for applause. He was there for souls. His words were sharp, his tone fearless, but underneath the fire was a tenderness few noticed at first. He did not despise those who opposed him. He invited them to the front of the line, saying, "Come, ask your hardest question." That courage became his signature. Students who came to humiliate him often left in silence, haunted not by defeat, but by the realization that they had encountered someone who believed with every fiber of his being. The rise was meteoric. From scattered college campuses, his voice thundered into auditoriums, conferences, and digital platforms. With every debate and every rally, his influence multiplied. Donors poured in millions, yet he refused to bow to their demands when they told him to leave Jesus out of it. His answer was unshakable. Without Christ, there is no message, no mission, no meaning. That defiance was costly, but it was holy. He reminded everyone who listened that politics is important, but compared to Jesus, it is peanuts. This wasn't just a slogan. It was the spine of his existence, and people could feel it. Imagine the weight of it all. Thousands of eyes fixed on him, endless travel, constant threats, and the burden of carrying truth into places where it was not wanted. The cracks began to show, but not in weakness, rather in his honesty about the cost. He admitted to friends, "I know they want me dead." These were not the words of paranoia, but of a man fully aware of the battle he had entered. He lived under constant security, not because he craved importance, but because he understood the danger of daring to speak truth in a world that prefers lies. Yet even under that shadow, he pressed forward with a joy that disarmed his enemies and inspired his followers. There is a lesson here that touches every heart willing to hear it. Greatness does not come without scars. To rise is to risk. Charlie's story reminds us that true influence is not measured by numbers on a screen, but by the weight of sacrifice behind the scenes. He built not only a movement, but also a testimony that one life fully surrendered can ripple through millions. And in that rise, He showed us that the crown of leadership is not authority. It is service, rooted in humility and lifted by faith. Think of his late-night study sessions, preparing for debates, poring over scripture, asking mentors for wisdom. Think of the endless flights, from America to Japan, preaching Christ even in nations where Christianity is rare. Think of his devotion to family, shutting off his phone to honor the Sabbath, teaching that success means nothing if it costs the ones you love. Every step upward was marked not just by strategy, but by surrender, not just by ambition, but by obedience. His fame was undeniable. Billions of views, stadiums filled, headlines written. But he never let the noise drown out the still small voice of God. That is why his rise was not like others. It was not built on ego or scandal, but on a relentless healing mission to make heaven crowded. And that mission kept him grounded even as the world tried to lift him higher than any man should stand. So what does this mean for us? It means that the cracks in our own lives, the doubts and dangers we face, are not disqualifications. They are qualifications. The very things that make us feel unworthy may be the tools God uses to make us unshakable. Charlie's rise to fame was never about fame at all. It was about showing that faith, lived boldly and without compromise, can change the course of nations. And yet, as the world applauded, as the influence spread like wildfire, shadows gathered at the edge of the stage. The weight of leadership grew heavier. The threats became louder. The man who seemed unstoppable was being hunted, and though his rise was glorious, it carried within it the seeds of conflict, setting the stage for a darker, more dangerous chapter that would test every ounce of his courage. Dark side and conflict. Every rise carries its shadows, and for Charlie Kirk, the brighter his light burned, the darker the forces around him became. To millions, he was a hero, bold, fearless, unwavering. But behind the applause was a battlefield filled with enemies who branded him with words like fascist, dangerous, and divisive. They did not see the man who prayed before every debate, who walked at night with friends speaking about resurrection and family. They only saw a threat to their world. And with that label came hate, threats, and the chilling reality that every step onto a stage could be his last. The weight of leadership pressed down like a crown of thorns. He was a husband, a father, a disciple of Christ, but he was also the face of a movement that drew both admiration and rage. Imagine what it feels like to hold your child in your arms one moment, and then the next moment walk onto a stage knowing someone in the crowd might be plotting your death. Imagine what it feels like to have donors whisper, "We love your politics, but keep Jesus out of it," and to respond without flinching, "Without Jesus, we are nothing." That is not strategy. That is sacrifice. He carried that cross willingly, but it left scars invisible to most. His own words cut like prophecy. "I know they want me dead." These were not words of fear, but of clarity. He understood the cost of truth. He understood that standing for Christ in an age of compromise meant inviting the wrath of those who hated light. Still, he chose to walk forward. He could have softened his message, spoken only of safe topics, hidden behind polished speeches. Instead, he stood outside, microphone in hand, calling students who disagreed to the front. Fascists silenced their opponents. Charlie gave them the microphone. That paradox drove his critics insane, but it also revealed the heart of his mission: love people enough to hear their questions, even if they mocked him, even if they spat in his face. The conflict was not just external. It lived inside him, in the tension of balancing public mission with private devotion. He longed to protect his family, to give Erica and their children peace. But he also knew he had been called to battle. His nightly walks, his whispered prayers, his questions about how to persuade young people to cherish marriage and truth, these revealed a soul carrying two worlds at once. The leader seen on stages was also a man kneeling in the dark, asking God for strength to carry the weight. And yet, in that inner wrestling, his character shone brightest. He practiced what he called humility before honor. He asked mentors to critique him, sought wisdom from every corner, and admitted when he was wrong. He fought pride like an enemy, reminding himself that one misstep in money, sex, or power could stain the mission. He lived by boundaries, refusing compromise even when million-dollar donors tried to bend him. He would rather lose funding than lose integrity. That choice, again and again, revealed the truth. His kingdom was not of this world. But make no mistake, the danger was real. Security surrounded him, not for show, but for survival. He traveled, knowing at any moment a bullet could fly, a protest could turn violent, a hand extended for a handshake could conceal a weapon. Still, he refused to retreat into safety. Ministry requires risk, he often said, and he lived it. Love without risk is not love at all. He risked reputation by saying what others were afraid to say. He risked his life by stepping onto hostile campuses. He risked being misunderstood by refusing to hide the name of Jesus. And through it all, he smiled, laughed, prayed, and pressed forward with relentless energy. There is a lesson hidden in this conflict. The higher you rise, the heavier the cross you carry. If you stand for truth, you will be misunderstood. If you speak with courage, you will be attacked. The question is not whether opposition will come. It is what you will do when it does. Will you shrink back into silence? Or will you walk forward knowing the cost? Charlie chose the latter, and in doing so, he left a blueprint for all who dare to live with conviction. Perhaps you have felt it too. The sting of being mocked for your faith, the loneliness of standing apart, the pressure to conform. Charlie's story whispers to you, do not yield. Let the insults become fuel. Let the threats remind you of the worth of your mission. Comment your thoughts. Do you believe true courage means embracing danger, or do you think safety should always come first? The answer you give shapes not only your path, but the legacy you leave. As the conflict deepened, as the darkness grew thicker, his story moved toward its most tragic and defining moment. The whispers of threat became the crack of a gunshot. The warnings he had spoken became reality, and in the chaos that followed, the world would see not just the cost of conviction, but the crown of martyrdom, climax and martyrdom. The morning of his final day dawned like any other, but destiny often hides itself in ordinary hours. Charlie Kirk walked into Utah Valley University carrying not fear, but faith. Crowds surged with excitement, chanting, waving, waiting for his voice to break through the noise of a broken culture. To his followers, it was another rally, another moment of truth. To him, it was an altar. He knew the risks. He had whispered to friends, "I know they want me dead." And yet he went anyway, because retreat was never an option when souls were at stake. The amphitheater was alive with energy, students pressing forward, flags waving, voices rising in unity. He greeted them with the warmth of a shepherd and the boldness of a warrior. He flipped hats into the crowd, laughed, shook hands, posed for photos, and then took his seat at center stage. His mission was simple but eternal: to answer the hardest questions, to point to Jesus as the only hope, and to remind a generation that truth is worth living and dying for. Then it happened. A sound that seemed to split time itself, a single crack from a rifle hidden in the distance. To some, it was a firework, a pop, a moment of confusion. But in an instant, Charlie's body lurched, his frame collapsing as if struck by invisible lightning. The crowd gasped, screams filled the air, and chaos swept like a wave through the arena. Security rushed, friends ducked, lives shattered in seconds. And in the center of it all, the man who had carried a cross his entire life now bore its final weight. Whilst they carried him with desperate urgency, loading him into a vehicle, hands pressing against wounds, voices crying out, "Come on, Charlie, stay with us!" Prayers filled the car, tears streamed, commands shouted through trembling voices. His friends pounded his chest, breathed into his lungs, fought to keep him tethered to this world, but his eyes told the truth, his lips could no longer speak. He was already gone. Fixed not on the chaos around him, but on eternity beyond, his gaze was lifted upward, past pain, past fear, locked on the Saviour he had served without compromise. The hospital tried. Doctors worked with all their strength, machines beeped, nurses moved with precision. For a moment, a pulse flickered, hope sparked, prayers roared. But the wound was catastrophic. No earthly skill could reverse what heaven had already claimed. Minutes turned into eternity, and finally the announcement came. He was gone. The shock was immediate, the grief unbearable. A man larger than life, silenced in an instant. News swept the nation. Headlines screamed, millions wept, conspiracy theories swirled. Was this random hatred, or was there something deeper at play? Why does evil so often strike at those who carry the light? The questions spread like wildfire, but in every church, every home, every heart that had been touched by his words, the answer was the same. His death was not defeat. It was testimony. In that moment of tragedy, something supernatural happened. What his enemies meant for evil became fuel for a movement. His martyrdom turned grief into resolve, sorrow into fire. People who had never opened a Bible suddenly searched its pages. Students who had mocked him whispered his name with reverence. Families who felt lost found themselves in church pews the following Sunday. He had said before, "If I had only 30 seconds to live, I would use them to tell someone about Jesus." And in the most haunting irony, a gunshot gave him not 30 seconds, but eternity, to preach louder than ever. The lesson of his final moments is etched in eternity. Life is fragile, truth is costly, and courage is everything. To live without fear of death is to live already victorious. He showed us that safety is not the highest goal. Obedience is. That comfort is not worth more than calling. That the greatest tragedy is not dying young, but living long without purpose. His blood watered the seeds he had planted, and from that soil new voices began to rise. As you hear this story, let it press deep into your soul. What would you risk for truth? Would you stand on a stage knowing a rifle might be aimed at your heart? Would you speak the name of Jesus when silence might spare your life? These are not abstract questions. They are the very battle lines of our age. Comment your thoughts. Do you believe his death was a senseless loss, or was it a divine spark meant to ignite millions? The chaos of that day will be remembered. The sound of that single shot will echo through history, but more powerful than the violence was the vision in his eyes, a vision of eternity, of a kingdom not built by hands, of a Saviour welcoming him home. And though the world wept, heaven rejoiced. The martyrdom of Charlie Kirk was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a legacy that no bullet, no enemy, no darkness could ever destroy. From that tragic climax, we now turn to what remains, his legacy, his reflection, and the unshakable truth that though one man fell, his mission marches on. When the dust settled and the echo of that single shot faded into silence, what remained was not just grief, but a living testimony, a reminder that one man's faith can outshine the darkest night. Charlie Kirk's story was never simply about politics, debates, or movements. It was about a flame that refused to be extinguished, a faith that stood tall when the world demanded compromise, a courage that chose sacrifice over silence. He had said it himself, "I want to be remembered for my faith." And now his life is a sermon carved into history, a message louder than any speech, echoing through every heart willing to listen. His legacy is not measured by headlines or statistics, but by the lives touched, the tears shed, the questions awakened in souls that once wandered without direction. Close your eyes and imagine his final gaze, fixed not on fear, not on pain, but on eternity. That vision is a gift to all of us, a reminder that the world may strike down the body, but it cannot silence the spirit. His story calls us to look deeper into our own lives. What are we living for? What would we risk everything to protect? And what will people say about us when our own final day arrives? These are not easy questions, but they are the ones that transform our existence from mere survival to sacred purpose. His life whispers to us, don't waste your days, don't silence your convictions, don't let fear chain your voice. And yet, in this tragedy, something powerful has been born. In churches, in campuses, in homes across the world, people are speaking his name, not in despair, but in determination. Young men and women who once felt voiceless now feel the courage to rise. Parents are teaching their children that truth matters more than comfort. Believers are finding strength in knowing that faith does not promise safety, but promises significance. His blood, like a seed, has watered a movement that will outlive the headlines. It is as if God himself turned mourning into mission, sorrow into strength, and loss into legacy. But his story is not just about what he did, it is about what we will do now. Will we carry forward the torch he held high? Will we love boldly even when mocked? Will we speak truth even when silenced? Will we live with the same fire that burned within him? Comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe his death was an end, or was it the spark of something greater? These conversations matter because they keep the mission alive, and they remind us that his sacrifice was not in vain. Think of the people who once dismissed him, who laughed at his words, who branded him with cruel names. Now many of them are wrestling with the reality that his conviction never wavered, that his courage was not rooted in ego, but in eternity. The same questions he asked on stage now echo in their hearts. Who is Jesus Christ? What will you do with the time you are given? His last moments were not empty. They were a final altar. a final invitation, a final witness. And through that witness, millions are being drawn to the light. For us, the lesson is clear. Life is short, fragile, fleeting. None of us know how many days we have, but every day we do have is a chance to live boldly, to live for something bigger than ourselves. Charlie lived as if eternity was one breath away, and that urgency made his words electric, his actions unforgettable, his mission unstoppable. You and I have the same choice before us, to waste our lives chasing shadows, or to pour them out like oil at the feet of something holy. If you feel his story stirring something in you, let it not fade. Let it become action. Speak truth in your circles, show kindness where it is rare, carry faith where it is mocked, and live as if your life has eternal weight, because it does. And if this video has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the beauty of faith, the cost of truth, and the power of courage, then I ask you gently, like, share, and subscribe, not as a gesture of vanity, but as a way of keeping this message alive. Your small act can ripple far, reaching someone who may be sitting in the dark tonight, desperate for hope. And if you feel called to support in a deeper way, know this. Every ounce of energy you send allows us to continue sharing stories like this. Stories that bring light into shadows. Stories that remind us we are not alone. Even the smallest encouragement becomes fuel for this mission. If you have ever felt this channel bring comfort to your soul, or light to your darkest days, then your support, whatever form it takes, is priceless. It allows me to keep going, to keep telling the truth, to keep lifting high the name of the one who gave Charlie strength and gives us hope still today. I thank you with all my heart for walking this journey with me. Together, we are not just watching a video, we are building a legacy of light, courage, and healing. Together, we are carrying the torch that Charlie held, ensuring it burns brighter than ever. The world is darker than we want to admit, but darkness cannot overcome light. As long as we keep speaking, keep loving, keep standing, the mission continues. And so, as we close this chapter, let us remember the man, the message, and the mission. He lived for truth, he died for faith, and now his story lives on through us. May we honor him not just with words, but with lives lived boldly, beautifully, and without compromise. Because in the end, the question is not how he will be remembered, it is how we will carry forward what he began. Together, let us make heaven crowded, and let us never let his voice be silenced.